Elevate TV, advancing kingdom lifestyle.
We have leadership styles that are very secular and not kingdom oriented or based.
We've had a series of protests were triggered.
There's a wind of change blowing, and that wind of change is going to catalyze leadership shifts.
The church,
You can't bend a tree when it is old,
yes,
but you can bend a plant when it is young. We must bring the next generation into their bent.
and the globalist,
Yoke of colonialism must be broken. The yoke of economic bondage must be broken so that the Africa can be free.
Hello, viewers, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the GG Report. I'm your host, Godfrey Gishoke, and this is another exciting episode. I am very happy to have you join us this evening. Maybe some of you are watching during the day or somewhere at whatever time on your in your home. I want to welcome you to this show, and today I am hosting a very, very wonderful guest with me on the set, and I'm going to be introducing him, and I'm going to also be introducing the subject matter of our discussion. But before we proceed, I want to ask you to share the links. If those of you that are watching us on the social media platform, as you know very well, we are live on Elevate TV Kenya Facebook page and YouTube channel. So please share the links with your friends, and also remember to comment, remember to leave your views, and let's get the conversation underway. And I always tell you that the GG Report is a platform for big, bold, and honest conversation. And today we're going to have a very, very honest conversation. We're going to touch on a broad range of issues, both geopolitical, spiritual matters, church matters, and this is going to be a very interesting conversation. We are talking about the church versus the globalist, an apostolic perspective, and I'm joined on the set by Apostle Michael Adefarasin. Welcome to the show, sir.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. I'm very, very happy to host you today. And I believe that our viewers are going to really flow with this conversation. I really felt that you have a very strong message for the church. And most of our viewers are church leaders. Some of them are church in all manner of areas, in governance, in the government. Some of them, people in the academy. So there is a broad range of viewers that watch this show. So we are going to engage them. So we are going to engage on this subject. Let me introduce my guest briefly. My guest is Michael Yemi Adefarasin. He's from Nigeria. He's a man of God and with a mandate. I just want to read actually the little profile on this book. Very, very interesting indeed. With a mandate from Isaiah 42, verse 6 to 7, Apostle Yemi, as he is fondly called, has a mission to raise leaders, to influence society, to tip the scales from the secular into kingdom culture. An apostle with a strong prophetic mantle and a strategic level spiritual warfare mandate characterized by the dismantling of territorial strongholds for the liberation of people. And I believe he has a very big heart for the African people. With a call to nations as an international conference speaker, the chief servant of a Kingdom Lifeline Apostolic Ministry, that is KLAM International. He provides oversight and covering to numerous ministries and sons around the globe. Apostle Yemi is married to Sharon, domiciled in Abuja, Nigeria, West Africa region. Welcome to the show, man of God. I'm very happy to have you here. And I think before we dive into the number of issues that have lined us for our conversation, I will ask you to give us a background. I have read this introduction, but this is not all. So tell us about your ministry and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I never wanted to do what I'm doing today. My ambition and aspiration in life was to pursue a career in aviation.
All right.
But that wasn't God's plan for me. So God had to take me through a series of breaking processes to bring me into a place of surrender where I ended up lifting up my hands. I was in a coma for 3 days.
Okay.
And when I came out of it, I found myself on my knees with my hands lifted up, and I said, Lord, if you work a miracle in my life, I'll serve you forever.
Right.
And so I had given my life to the Lord way before then. And so God said, well, remember 3 years ago, I told you to leave your nation, leave your family, leave your profession, and go to Ghana. And there I will set you free. And I said, Lord, I remember. He said, will you go now? And I said, Lord, I will go.
Right.
And I entered into a whole new phase in my life. And so Ghana was a training ground for me to embrace the call of God upon my life. And I lived in Ghana, and I was under the ministry of Archbishop Nicholas Duncan Williams,
All right.
who was an instrument that God used, and God gave me a lot of mentors and teachers. So I lived in Ghana for 7 years.
Wonderful.
And then from there, God sent me to the Republic of Benin on the west coast of Africa. And there, I was a pioneer of the charismatic movement there, and I lived there for 14 years.
Wow.
And went through many, many, many experiences. And then from there, I moved back to Abuja, Nigeria. So I've had the privilege of serving in different countries, serving the Lord, educated in different countries, England and America. So God has been using that to give me a worldview.
Wonderful.
So you see things from a bigger perspective than what we tend to look at, especially when we're in a subjective situation.
That's true. That's true. Your call sounds very similar to Abraham's call. You know, Abraham was called to go to a land that God would show him. So I think your call to Ghana was more or less like an Abrahamic call. You know?
It was very, God was dealing with me.
Right.
Like he was dealing with Abraham. But one of the things that I would emphasize is that in that call, God was baptizing me into the fellowship of the sufferings of Christ.
Wonderful.
And that's something that many people don't like to mention or to talk about. So God was baptizing me into the ministry of the fellowship of the sufferings of Christ, which is part of a calling. So I had to go through many, many, many bitter, painful, but exciting experiences that God was using to shape me into what I am today. At one point in time, I used to pray, God, I'm tired of going through all these sufferings, until an intercessor, very strong intercessor in the United States of America in Dallas, called me and said she was praying for me, and God said I should stop telling him not to take me through the experiences and the fellowship of his sufferings.
Right.
Because then I was truncating God's purpose for my life.
Wow.
Yeah. So I should embrace the sufferings.
Right.
Because God wants to glorify his name through them.
Wonderful.
That was
You know,
profound.
It reminds me of Paul and the thorn in the flesh. It's sort of a situation. You know, Paul pleading with the Lord, look, spare me this pain, spare me the thorn, whatever it was. And I guess that's really part of the apostolic journeys. Wonderful. I'm sure we would love to hear all the stories more and more. Yes, but we want to dive into, before we talk about Africa, because that's really and the globalist agenda and what's going on in the African scene, and you know, your involvement in speaking to leaders, raising leaders. Let's talk about your involvement in the global apostolic movement. You're part of the leadership of ICAL. ICAL is International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, led by Apostle John Kelly in the US. And there is actually an annual conference coming up in November this year, which I believe that some of the leaders listening to us who would be interested can just go to www.ical.org.
I think it's either org.
Once they search, they'll find it.
But once you put International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, it will come up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell us about your vision, the vision of ICAL, and your role in that global movement.
Okay, I joined ICAL as far back as I think 2010.
Okay.
From South Africa, because I used to go to a friend of mine. Her ministry was Ariel Gate, and John Kelly came to South Africa to commission ICAL over there. Mm-hmm. And as you know, Peter Wagner handed over ICAL back to John Kelly.
Right.
And he's built it into a horizontal network where apostolic leaders, not apostles, but apostolic leaders can converge together and cross-pollinate and share what God is doing in their various countries. So we have a bird's eye view and a global perspective of how God is moving on the globe and the things that God is doing.
Right.
And I think that's really very great, because sometimes we become so insular, stuck in our own little space, and all we see is what is around us, rather than seeing things from a bird's eye view.
Right.
Yeah, so ICAR affords that bird's eye view, so we can see things from a global perspective with a world view, and not from just your personal subjective experience and perspectives.
Right.
And so that's really one of the major benefits from ICAR. Every year we gather. So far it's been in Dallas, and we share what God is doing and things that God is saying.
Yes.
And so we can now begin to synergize and cross-pollinate and network.
Okay.
And that's really very phenomenal. Yeah.
So ICAL, so you got into ICAL through that meeting up in South Africa.
Yes.
You could talk about the ICAL in Africa. What are the other places where ICAL is involved here in Africa?
So we have the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders. I'm just coming from Rwanda, so we have one in Rwanda under Apostle Paul Gitwaza, who's doing a very great work in Rwanda. We have one here, Kenya.
Right.
Kenya was birthed, I think, a year ago almost.
Yes.
Yes, and under the convener of Apostle David Juma,
right,
who's a very relational leader, and that's really, really very great. We have ICAL in Nigeria.
Right.
And Apostle Joseph Adefarasin is the convener there, and also the convener for Africa.
Right.
There's one in South Africa. It has to be revamped. And so we have different nations, and I think in a week or so, we'll be commissioning ICAL in Cote d'Ivoire, on the West African coast. So we have ICAL spreading across the continent of Africa. We have one in Togo. We have one in Ghana. So we're growing. We're growing, and there's Liberia as well.
Yes.
So we're growing and growing. Yeah,
I love that. I love that. You know, most of our Kenyan leaders in this part, you know, we are in the East. I think there has been that network between the East and the West. And the Nigerian church in particular, and the leaders in Nigeria have had a very huge influence here in Kenya. And I see that growing interrelationship between the leadership in the West and the leadership in the East. And perhaps ICAL can be that platform that brings that leadership together. Do you see that role?
Yes, it is, because in ICAL you have very distinguished men of God, women of God, who have paid their dues, who are mature, who are strategic thought leaders, theologians, people of experience. Even in the marketplace, you have a lot of marketplace people, marketplace apostles, and so on and so forth. So it opens us to their experiences as well, and opens them to our experiences as well.
Yes.
So we have again a worldview. Depending on where life has positioned you, your ability to apprehend and comprehend revelatory knowledge is affected.
Yes.
So, for example, the scriptures tell us that in heaven, the Apostle John saw the throne of God and the Lamb sitting on the throne. From one perspective, he saw him as a lion. From another perspective as an ox, from another perspective as an eagle, from another perspective as a man. So depending on where life has positioned you, your view of God is affected.
Right.
Yeah. So we may see God as a lion, and in America they may see God as the eagle. So we would be arguing God is a lion, and they're saying God is an eagle.
Right.
But when we understand that God is both a lion and an eagle and an ox and a man, then we get totality of perspective.
Absolutely.
And that's what we need in these days, in these end times.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I think that's very profound, very enriching. It really helps clarify, and I'm very happy that the leaders, the apostolic leaders, are leading us in that direction. So, so let's talk about your involvement in championing leadership. Our viewers, I want to let you know that Apostle Adefarasin has actually been involved in leadership, and he has had the privilege of speaking to African leaders. And recently, after his involvement in speaking to the African leadership, was it in the AU forum?
In Ethiopia.
It was in
under
Ethiopia.
the auspices of the African Leadership Organization.
Okay.
That runs a magazine, this magazine, the Africa Leadership Magazine.
Okay.
And every year in different nations, Africa, the United Kingdom, America, they will gather all African leaders,
right,
to come in and meet and give them awards for their service, and they will give keynote addresses. So it's a place where you can network.
Okay.
A platform where you can network with African leaders.
Wonderful.
From across all the sectors of society. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And governance.
Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, Apostle Adefarasin had the privilege of actually being featured on this particular African Leadership Magazine. This is actually one of the leading African magazine, Leadership Magazine. Some of you are familiar with the Forbes Africa. This is at that same level, if not higher. Actually, this is a very, very important magazine, and it's such a privilege for being featured here. And I'm sure you have a message for African leaders. Let's talk about the message you have for the African leaders.
Well, God just thrust me into this space, and it had been prophesied over time, but I didn't know how it would unfold. But through the auspices of the Africa Leadership Organization and magazine, I was privileged to give an address in Ethiopia at their annual awards ceremony to leaders who have distinguished themselves in their different communities or sectors of society, especially in government and governance. And in that address, I mentioned three things.
Okay.
And the first thing I mentioned was that there's a wind of change blowing, and that wind of change is going to catalyze leadership shifts.
Right.
The second thing I mentioned was that there's going to be a youth quake. And the epicenter of that youth quake would be Africa.
Okay.
And the third thing that I did say was that the yokes of colonialism, neocolonialism, economic colonialism has to be broken.
Right.
God wants the yoke of economic bondage to be broken off the African continent, the nations within the African continent.
That's true. That's
Yes.
true. Powerful, powerful message. Very, very powerful. And mentioning, I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit on especially, so there is a wind of change of leadership coming to Africa. And that is actually needed. As one of the people who observe the dynamics in the African leadership, your nation, Nigeria, has gone through its own, very tumultuous time, when you had military leadership and then you came to civil leadership, and your nation has been transforming over time, and you have had your own share of challenges, same as here in Kenya. Right now, I think, and this is what I want you to comment on, the challenge of the old leadership model in Africa. Leaders that, they are political leaders, especially in the government, that are still seeing Africa in that liberation mode, but they don't actually see the way the world has shifted so much. So they are happy to conduct elections, install these party operatives into leadership. Yet the world is looking for a new generation of leaders that can cope with the change that is going on globally. Do you see that, like the current crop of African leaders being disconnected with the realities that are shaping the global leadership scene?
Well, I think that our leaders are disconnected with divine agendas that God has for our nations and for our continent and for his kingdom. So I tend to see things from a kingdom perspective. And because we know that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and all them that dwell therein. And so we have to look at things from his perspective and what God wants. And part of the challenge is that we have leadership styles that are very secular and not kingdom oriented or based.
Yes.
As a result, many leaders have been raised up that don't have the requisite skills, haven't been through the processes of character development, so they lead with honesty and integrity. And as a result, when they get into power, the character flaws shows up, the inadequacies show up, and and they lead, and their perspective is they see themselves as rulers,
Right.
and not as servants.
Right. Yes. Yes.
That is a big problem, because you're not called to leadership over a nation to lord it over the nation. You are called to be a servant of the citizenry of that nation. And as because they see things as from a ruling perspective, lording it over people, the buck stops with me, they pervert the leadership.
Okay.
Rather than seeing themselves as a servant that are called to serve the citizens of the nation.
I think they should give you a chance to address the AU in the next sitting, so that you can give them that same those same words, because as you clearly note that leadership that is based on this hierarchical, very autocratic way of leadership, and not the servant leadership, where you, at the end of the day, you are a servant. Reminds me of when the Western world were adopting such terms as prime minister, like chancellor in Germany, for example.
Yeah.
The prime minister is actually a chief servant.
Yes.
So African leaders have forgotten that when you become a president, you don't become the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings.
Yeah.
You are actually a servant to the people. That's a major issue. The other issue you've raised is you're calling it the wave, the young generation,
The youth quake.
Yeah.
Because I read a book, I can't remember who it's by, but it's called Youth Quake.
Okay.
Yeah, and God started to speak to me out of it after my spiritual daughter of mine had introduced it to me, but something just broke in and resonated in my spirit.
Yes.
And then that was just the point of contact that God needed to begin to download a lot of information and revelation about his plans and purposes, especially in the world and in the continent of Africa. And because I'm very biblically based and try to be Christocentric, in Malachi chapter 4 verse 5, God says that in the last days he will restore the heart of the fathers to the sons and the sons to the fathers, which means that God knew that there was going to be a generational disconnect, and he wants to heal that generational disconnect, because God is a multi-generational God. At every moment in time, he's thinking minimum 3 generations. He's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so there must be redemptive legacy and inheritance passed down to the generations, because he's a trans-generational God.
That's true.
Yes. And now there's a disconnect, and he wants to heal that disconnect for his own very predetermined purposes. Yeah. So it's very important.
Absolutely, and I believe you are aware. I don't want to. I'm sure this information has reached you that in our nation here in Kenya, we've had a major youth uprising. We're calling it the Gen Z movement. And a series of protests were triggered sometime early in June. And first of all, there was the issue of the budget. There's usually the government year comes to an end in June, and just before the financial year is done, the government is obligated to present a budget. So a certain budget was brought to the House, to Parliament. And along with the budget, according to our current arrangement, there is what we call, it's called Public Finance Act 20, every year, has to be refreshed every year, such that if you're going to tax, you're going to change any little bit, even if it's you're moving the, say, like custom tax from 14 to 14.5, that has to be embedded in an act of parliament. So when this finance bill came up, 2024, the Gen Z, the young people, rose up. I'm actually setting up the question, although I'm being told we have 2 minutes. But the young people rose up and saying we must reject that financial bill. again, the tax issue and all the other issues that were laid out in this very elaborate tax, bill. And it was rejected, and that led to a crisis in this country. I want you to begin to speak to that. And do you, have you seen the same movement in your nation, especially Nigeria? I think we've gotten some wind that something like that is coming up. And what are you seeing here in terms of, even in the spirit, what's going on?
So in a nutshell, there is this wind of change.
Right.
And there is this youthquake. Mm-hmm. A generation is rising up.
All right.
And God is going to use them to catalyze change. Change of leadership, removal of leadership, and replacement of leadership with people that would favor God's righteous cause for nations. Mm-hmm. That youthquake, like the wind of change, is a God thing.
Right.
So nobody except God will be able to abate or to terminate this youthquake. And the youthquake has Africa as its epicenter.
Right.
Because God has a redemptive destiny and purpose for the continent as a whole. And so God is going to use the next generation to initiate all the changes that God wants, so that the nations and so that the continent can come into its redemptive destiny and purpose. I must emphasize,
yes,
that nobody, no army, no law enforcement agency will be able to stop it. It's a God thing. They can abate it, but that fire will rekindle and it will continue until God fulfills his purposes.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you follow this conversation, I believe you are flowing with us as we talk about the changes, the wave, this absolutely amazing wind of change that is coming into Africa. So let's hold that conversation there. We take a short break. When we come back, we return to that conversation. Don't go away. Keep it elevate. Just grab yourself a cup of coffee and let's come back to this conversation.
Life Church International invites you to Assembly 2024. This is not just a gathering, it's a divine encounter. Join Apostle David and Pastor Sunte Juma for a joint service that unites all LCI churches and affiliate ministries. Mark your calendar for 25th August at Eastern Bypass Infinity from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Experience powerful worship, inspiring messages, and a community united in faith. Don't miss this extraordinary event. See you there.
Welcome back. This is the GG Report. We are talking about the church and the globalist. I know we haven't touched the globalist yet, but we are laying the ground. We're just talking about what God is saying to the leaders in Africa. My guest, Apostle Michael Adefarasin, he's a voice speaking to the African leaders. And he has a message for the nations of Africa. Before we went to the break, we were talking about the three key issues that the Lord has laid in his heart, which is what he's communicated to the African leaders, the wind of change that is coming, the rising wind, youthquake, and the change that is coming to that. So before we went to the break, men of God, you have described the youthquake, and you've said very clearly that it is unstoppable. No government, no military power can stop this?
Because it's a God thing.
It is a God thing.
Yeah.
What is your message to that generation of young people that actually are now raising their voice? Maybe they might lose direction. They might actually, I'm sure you have a word for them to guide them, because I believe this change is sent of God, like you say, but maybe there is something that these young people need to hear from the fathers. Please speak to the young people.
Okay, so we understand that you feel disenfranchised, and we identify with you completely. We identify that you are the next generation, you are the future leaders of our nations, and there is much discontent with past and present leadership on the continent and in the world. And there are agendas that are draconian, that are against God. And God is sovereign over man and nation alike. But what I need you to understand is you're doing the right thing, but you must do it the right way.
Right.
It's possible to do the right thing the wrong way and not achieve the results.
Exactly.
So you must call upon God to show you the ways and the strategies to employ to achieve the redemptive purposes that the God wants for your lives and for our nations. I repeat, the key word is redemptive purposes. That's very, very key. Now, we are in an apostolic transition. We're in a kingdom transition. I call it apostolic transition. And every moment in time, God is dealing with, as I said earlier, 3 generations. So Moses, when they came, Moses' generation, they came out of Egypt. There were their sons, Joshua and Caleb, the second generation.
Right.
And in their sojourn in the wilderness, another generation was born called the wilderness, that I call the wilderness sons, that may, we can attach the name Gen Z to them.
Yes, yes.
The Moses generation died in the wilderness, but he had transferred, that generation had transferred their value systems and belief systems to the Joshua generation. They took over from the Moses generation.
Right.
And the Joshua generation was supposed to lead the wilderness sons, the sons born into the wilderness, Gen Z, across the Jordan into the fulfillment of the promises of God for their lives.
Yes.
So Joshua generation was link leadership. They were holding the hands of the Moses generation and holding the hands of the Gen Z generation, or the wilderness sons.
Yes.
To transfer the value systems and the belief systems. And then Joshua had the privilege of leading that generation in to possess their promises. So Gen Z, Gen Alpha, Beta, there has to be a connect between the Elijahs and the Elishas, so that there can be a transfer of the values and the belief systems, because you cannot do things in isolation. We know that you are disgruntled with the present level of church leadership, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because not everybody's a rotten egg. So there are some authentic leaders that God has raised up for such a time as this, and you must link up with them. And then to the leaders, especially the church leaders, our focus must shift. We must shift our focus to the next generation.
Right.
You know what they say, you can't bend a tree when it is old.
Yes.
But you can bend a plant when it is young. We must bring the next generation into their bent their redemptive legacy and purpose. So we as a church, if we call ourselves the Joshuas, the transitional leaders, the link leaders,
Yes.
then we must focus on establishing redemptive legacy to the next generation. We must look at them. We must focus upon them. We must disciple them and instill the right values, because they're the future leaders of our nations and in the kingdom of God. Just as Joshua led the wilderness sons to cross the Jordan and possess the promised land. There was a failure there because Joshua did not finish transferring all the values, so they couldn't drive everybody out of the land. But
Yeah, sure. And it's true actually, including a crisis of leadership that actually came up after Joshua.
Yes.
To the extent that Joshua, at the end of his life, he said, me and my house, I'm going to serve the Lord. You guys decide.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so...
which is what has happened in our African space, in that for some reason our leaders are just one generation. All they think about is themselves.
Right.
So remember when we were growing up when we were children, you'd go out. I took a walk with Apostle this morning. I could see Bata. I could see all Leventis and all those shops. And all those shops would have their signage, Leventis and Co. or Juma and Sons.
Yes.
But today, you don't see that. All you see is myself and I. No, myself and Co. and Sons.
Right.
So we've lost that generational mindset. And the generations have just been, and leadership have just been building to establish their empires and make themselves, provide comfort for themselves rather than build generational succession.
Absolutely. You've noted something very profound. And because the values that in societies get translated in business, for example, that's a very profound observation, that you don't see companies or even shops or enterprises that are called so-and-so and sons.
No.
So that has died off. In other words, sons are no longer being brought into what the fathers are doing. And that disconnect is actually what has produced the crisis we have among young people, because they are saying, look, you've left us out of the equation, and so we have a voice. Now, while we are still on that, you have actually also done a book here, the Joseph Mandate, which is, I think, part of that conversation of transitioning leadership. And maybe you could tell us what, the argument that you're laying out in this Joseph, why the Joseph Mandate?
Okay, so prophetically, it's Africa's time to arise.
Okay.
We know that. So God has a redemptive destiny and purpose for the continent as a whole.
Right.
And Joseph became, according to the scriptures, the prime minister of Egypt.
Exactly.
But I submit to you that Egypt was a generic name for Africa. So they just biblically saw Africa as Egypt.
Right.
Yeah. Or the land of the Nile.
Yes.
So basically, Joseph became prime minister of Africa.
Yes.
And he brought a mindset transformation. He brought systemic reformation for sustainable revival. Because Africa's destiny is to provide leadership to the world, spiritual, to provide socio-political leadership to the world, and thirdly, economic sustenance to the world, God's way, but not the globalist way.
Wonderful. Now we've touched on the globalist, and that's yeah, we were getting there. So now let's address this, the globalist. But you've raised three issues. Africa is to provide,
sustenance,
Sustenance.
spiritual leadership,
Yes.
socio-political or economic leadership,
Yes.
and sustenance to the world. The reason why I say so is because looking at the Word of God, which is our manual for life and living, during the time of Joseph,
Yes.
the whole world came to Joseph, to Africa, to buy food,
Yes.
to buy grain.
It's so profound when you read the story in Genesis. Actually, it says exactly those words, to buy grain.
Yes.
You know, there was a real
Yes.
crisis, economic crisis.
Yes. And the world is going into famine. There is a food shortage in the world. And so the redemptive destiny for Africa is to provide sustenance first for Africa, or first for Joseph's family, then for all the Egyptians, and then for the whole world. So in a time of
Absolutely.
world famine, Africa was in prosperity, and they were selling their grain to the rest of the world.
Wonderful.
But the agenda, the globalist agenda, has got it the other way around.
Okay.
Yeah, they want sustenance for themselves first, at the expense of the indigenous people to whom God has bequeathed that wealth as an inheritance. So that is a problem. So the yoke of colonialism must be broken. The yoke of economic bondage must be broken, so that the Africa can be free to develop its resources, to refine its resources, provide empowerment for Generation Z, because they're highly educated, highly informed, very zealous, but disenfranchised. They don't have jobs.
Right.
They're in poverty. 80% of Africa is in poverty, in spite of the rich endowments of resources that God has put on the African continent.
There you go. That is what the message you should be repeating in every African leadership forum. And I'm glad that God has really opened the door for you to say these things, because indeed there is a challenge. And now, speaking about Africa being the solution, you know, the scene you paint Joseph in Egypt and the strategy he raised in Egypt during those, you know, they were actually 14 years, because there were 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So 14 years economic blueprint that actually did save the world.
Yes, and it was phenomenal, because Joseph also developed the technology to preserve the grain for 14 years.
Yes.
The food for 14 years. And he developed food preservation systems, silos in all the key cities. He developed all the systems. Let me backtrack a little. The 7 years of prosperity followed by 7 years of famine. So Joseph's wisdom was that in the years of prosperity, live as if you're in years of poverty.
Right.
So that you can save the surplus. Because people would normally tend to adjust their standard of living to their disposable income. So if your disposable income increases, your standard of living increases.
Yes.
Joseph says no. Live as if you're in years of famine, so that you have a surplus, so that at the end of the 7 years, that surplus that you have saved will be enough to take you through the years of famine. But what do our nations do? We experience a economic boom, oil boom, like Nigeria,
right?
And then we blow it all. And not enough infrastructure, not enough industrial or manufacturing infrastructure, nothing to show for it.
Right.
So you miss God in that way. So Joseph, now this is the key, and I talk about Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh had that dream, and he saw the 7 years of prosperity symbolized by fat cows.
Right.
And then 7 years of famine symbolized by lean, ugly, and gaunt cows.
Right.
And Genesis 41 says that for a brief moment in time, they stood by one another, side by side.
Yes.
And then the lean, ugly cows ate up the fat cows. In other words, the years of famine will eat up the years of prosperity.
Exactly.
But then I took it to another level, because an ox, as in what Pharaoh saw in the dream, represents part of a cultivation system.
Right.
Because you have to yoke the ox to plowing equipment to break up the soil. So the ox is part of a cultivation system. So we have to begin to think systemically.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
And so Joseph, the Egyptian systems were failing. And that's why the Josephs were needed and became relevant. And so Joseph develops systems. He goes, first of all, he goes around Africa. He does an inventory of all the resources of Africa. Then he develops auditing systems for all that inventory. Then he develops a model of building food reserve systems in all the key cities. Then he develops transportation systems to link all those cities together, and then that federal model is replicated on a city level and in a local level.
Wow.
Then he develops the preservation systems, the food bank systems. Then he goes on, he develops so many other systems. So now if you have all those transportation systems, then you better have the equipment to maintain the transportation systems.
Actually, I want you to link that to the crisis, the global, in a forum we had early this morning, you talked about how the globalists, and this is something we must touch here. Well, when we say globalist, we know who we are talking about. It's much more than IMF and World Bank. We're talking about, for example, the World Economic Forum and the actors within those forums that really are overreaching their mandates and influencing, sovereign nations, to do certain things. Speak to that and link that to that Joseph model and show how, or rather explain to our African leaders that if they are not careful, they are going to get entangled. For example, the debt in Africa. Speak to that.
Okay, so basically what has happened is the colonialists, yes, have colonized our mindsets, yes. And so what is happening is that the whole world's focus is on Africa. All the resources in Africa, the resources in Congo that are used to provide electronic equipment like your phone.
Yes.
And all the gold and all the oil and all the gas. Africa is so richly endowed that there is enough to feed Africa and the rest of the world.
Right.
But what has happened with the globalist agendas is that they will give us money in the name of development, and at the end of the day, they will invest so that they can draw greater dividend out of Africa. So their economies are thriving off the resources of Africa, while the people of Africa are being deprived of those resources.
Right.
Why? Because they are refining those resources in their countries, providing employment and jobs for their people, while the African people are disenfranchised. So we are saying, no, that may be part of a global agenda, but that's not God's agenda for us. That's not God's agenda for Africa. God's agenda is that the African people will be able to refine their own raw materials, produce them, and then sustain the world with them. So the Africans are empowered, and the whole world is also empowered.
Absolutely. And I love that vision, because we are saying it's not that Africa must isolate itself.
No, definitely not.
But like you say, he who pays the piper calls the tune, isn't it? So if we allow the global actors to actually then give us their money, speak to the issue of debt, because that is an issue.
So
big
part
issue.
of the agenda has always been to use financial instruments to enslave the nations economically. You know that the scriptures tell us that the borrower is slave to the lender. God doesn't want any nation in debt. You won't find in the Bible godly nations that were in debt. There were systems in place for the sustenance of every nation if we just obeyed the principles that are laid out for us in the manual of life. But now the nations come to us, the globalist institutions come to us and say, we're ready to help you. We will lend you money. And because of the corruption of our leaders, we're greedy for the money, and we take the money, and we don't do what we're supposed to do with the money. We mismanage the money. We don't steward the resources well. So they give us money, and they have conditionalities attached to that money. So if you borrow money from the World Bank or the IMF, they're going to come with conditionalities. What was it before? You have to restructure your economy. So they call it restructuring the economy. And then they introduce privatization. You have to divest yourself of all the key
infrastructure
and privatize it.
Yes.
And then we'll make laws. Okay, so there will be 60% indigenous equity, and then maybe 40% foreign investment. But the people that have the 60% indigenous equity go around the back door and sell that to the foreigners,
equity holders.
Yes. So the foreigners now hold the major share of investment over key infrastructure, electricity, for example, transportation, for example, for Kenya, your port system, for example, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And when you hold major equity in the key infrastructure, then you can control government.
Absolutely. Men of God, you can't imagine that we've run out of time. But what you've just said is so profound. And I want you to sum up and give a message to especially the church leaders who are leading our churches, because they need to speak this to their young people and to their congregation. Because I believe, men of God, what gets preached, what gets spoken from pulpit shapes the nation, shapes the mindset of our people. And so I want you to speak that, because that's very, very important for our leaders to hear.
So, church, we're in a Hosea chapter 4 verse 6 situation. My people perish for lack of knowledge, because we have rejected knowledge, therefore you may no longer be my priest. So basically, as much as we know the little we know of the word of God, we must have a global mindset. We must have a worldview. We must be eschatologically illiterate. We must understand what God's times and seasons are, his kingdom agendas, as compared to the world agendas. So when we are conversant with his kingdom agendas, this is what God is saying, this is what God is doing in the context of time, from now till tomorrow to long term, and this is the global agenda that is disparate to the kingdom agenda. Then we can teach people that what is happening now is this, that God has said, and this agenda is not divine.
Yes.
This is the original. And then we can advise our governments that, hey, listen, what you are playing into is not of God.
Absolutely.
That's not God's way.
Right.
That's another agenda that is draconian. And if you follow that agenda, you will plunge our nation into chaos, into debt, into bondage, into slavery, and disenfranchise the generations, and try to abort the redemptive destiny and purpose of that nation, for which God will remove you and then replace you with somebody that would favor his righteous cause.
Absolutely. That's a very good place to end this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, I would have loved to keep the man of God, Apostle Michael Adefarasin, here, but as you can tell, we've run out of time. But you have heard the word. You've heard the church, our leaders, bishops and church leaders. Pass the message. Speak the word. Be bold and speak to the nations. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I am so blessed. I believe this is a message that is timely for this nation. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord empower you. Don't keep silent. Speak to the people. Speak to the leaders. And may the voice of the kingdom be heard. May the Lord bless you so much. That's all we had for you tonight. I'm your host, Godfrey Gishoke. This is the GG Report. Keep it elevated. God bless you. We'll see you another time. Same channel. Bye for now.